Everybody can hear me here? The microphone's working fine? We have a little echo up here. It's great to see you all here, particularly on such a wet and windy day. My name is Owen O'Connell. I'm a professor of philosophy here at Manhattan University. Welcome all to the Tom Regan Memorial Lecture. And without any further ado, I'm going to ask Martin Rowe to come up to the podium and make some introductions. Please welcome Martin Rowe.
Well, thank you very much. This is the part of the show where we have to thank everybody, and you wonder when we're going to get on to the actual lecture, but bear with me. We will get here eventually. So thank you to Manhattan University for hosting us, and to Kwasi Bodkin as well for all of his work on the event. This is a multiple sponsored event that's happening today. Carol Glasser of the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association is the co-host. We have been working at the Culture and Animals Foundation to sponsor monthly webinars, of which is this one is the November edition. So thank you to her. Lisa Burnell of the Animals and Society Institute, Lisa's based in South Africa, helped set up the talk online, and she has been working on behalf of the Culture and Animals Foundation and ASI for several years. So thank you to them. Thank you, obviously, to the American Anti-Vivisection Society. There's going to be a lot of acronyms thrown around today, so AAVS, and particularly to Sue Leary, who agreed to be the respondent to Professor Scott's talk today, and I'll introduce Sue shortly, and to Sarah Scott for giving the 2025 Tom Regan Memorial Lecture, and I'll introduce Sarah shortly as well. So, who was Tom Regan? Well, Tom Regan co-founded the Culture and Animals Foundation, and with his wife, Nancy, not to be confused with the president's wife, but Nancy and Tom co-founded Culture and Animals Foundation in Raleigh, North Carolina, 40 years ago this year, and their main aim is to support scholars and artists with a commitment to animal rights. Tom literally wrote the book on animal rights, cunningly called The Case for Animal Rights, which came out in 1982, and is the signature volume on the deontological, for the philosophers among you, reason why we should support and care about animals. The Culture and Animals Foundation gives out annual grants. Check out January the 1st for our open invitation for grant applications for artists and scholars on our website. We host an arts prize, we host an annual lecture, which is what this is, and we also have an annual fellowship to study at the archives that Tom set up at North Carolina State University, where he taught for 34 years, called the Animal Welfare and Animal Rights Archives. That archive has now grown to the largest animal welfare and animal rights archive in the United States. It contains the archives of the Humane Society of the United States, the digital archives of the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and a host of other archives. And Sarah was a fellow there in 2024, where she was studying the work of Frances Power Cobbe, whom you will be hearing about today. What was even better was that she then went on with the research that she had studied at the NCSU archives on the Reagan Fellowship to the National Humanities Center up the road in Durham, North Carolina, to write up her work. It was at the National Humanities Center that Tom wrote The Case for Animal Rights. Two philosophers over the distance of 43 years. So we at CAF thought it was appropriate for Sarah to bring the wheel full circle, as it were, and give a public talk about CAF as part of the Tom Regan Lecture. It also happens to be a good time this year because this is the 150th anniversary of the founding by Frances Power Cobbe of the National Anti-Vivisection Society in the UK, as well as the 40th anniversary, as I said, of the founding of CAF, and the 40th anniversary of the fabled sit-in at the National Institutes of Health, the 4-day sit-in by animal advocates to stop animal cruelty, which was led by that philosopher, Tom Regan. So, a good set of synergies there. It's also, this lecture, an opportunity for us to announce that we are going to be partnering next year with the American Anti-Vivisection Society on 2 grants to an artist that is reimagining and reconceptualizing animals in science generally and animals in vivisection in such a way as to persuade a different facet of the human experience as opposed to science and facts and knowledge. We want art and imagination and creativity. So we will be doing that. All right. So now is a very good time to talk about the use of animals in science as a technical, political, scholarly, and moral vector for how we humans view other animals. And so we need to look back at Frances Power Cobbe. So this is what will happen. Sarah will give the talk, then Sue will respond, and then we will have a chance to answer some questions. You can ask some questions at the end. We will also be taking questions from you online. Hello, from all over the world. For those of you online, put your questions in the chat, and then Carol will read them out, or we'll read them out and get them to the speakers. So first, Sue Leary has been president and CEO of the Alternatives Research and Development Foundation since 1995. She has a BS in biology and an MS in nonprofit management. Sue is also president emerita of the American Anti-Vivisection Society, for which she served as president from 1995 to 2025. From 2009 to 2025, Sue was chair of the Coalition for Consumer Information on Cosmetics, which operates the Leaping Bunny program for companies based in the US and Canada. Sue also served from 20 to 24 on the Scientific Advisory Committee on Alternative Toxicological Methods, which advises and makes recommendations to National Institutes of Health officials regarding activities of the Interagency Coordinate Committee for the Validation of Alternative Methods. So she knows whereof she speaks. And then finally, our speaker, Sarah Scott, teaches and conducts research in ethics and the history of philosophy at Manhattan College, focusing particularly on forgotten or interdisciplinary philosophers. She is the editor of the book Martin Buber, Creaturely Life and Social Form from Indiana University Press. And she has published several studies of Buber's ethics, aestheticism, and forgotten influences. Her current research, as you will find out soon, is on another overlooked and extraordinary interdisciplinary philosopher and activist, the Anglo-Irish philosopher, theologian, social reformer, and leading anti-vivisectionist, Frances Power Cobbe, 1822 to 1904, for the 8th annual Tom Regan Lecture, Sarah Scott.
Thank you very much, Martin, for that very kind introduction. It's a real honor to be selected to give the Tom Regan Memorial Lecture. And I'm very pleased to see my ethics students and my faith and reason students in the class, as well as other lovers of philosophy here. So thank you for that. And we're just getting the PowerPoint set up. Great, thank you. All right, so to begin, I want to bring you back to the context in which Cobbe was working. Imagine that women cannot vote, that they are banned from higher education, that once they marry, all of their property and income belong to their husband, and that it is extremely difficult to divorce or separate, even in cases of abuse. Imagine also that you have never heard the term animal rights, that animal rights are in a sense unthinkable, for there is no conceptual framework that would allow them to be thought. Animals exist only as property, and there is little protection against their abuse. Now imagine that even though you don't have the vocabulary or theory to express yourself, you sense something is very wrong and you want to change all that. Where would you begin? Today, I want to show you some of the ways that Cobbe used ethical theory and rhetorical strategies to change moral understanding. So Cobbe was born in 1822 in Ireland and then spent the last 2/3 of her life in England and Wales. One of the most well-known public moralists of her day, she published over 24 books. Extremely successful, these helped build the transatlantic women's rights and animal advocacy movements. She embraced 19th century print culture as well, For 6 years, 3 times a week, she wrote editorials for The Echo, the London evening newspaper, reaching their 100,000 readers, an audience academics could only dream of. She published numerous articles in high-profile journals and an astounding number of pamphlets. She estimated she wrote some 300 articles and pamphlets just against vivisection. Her writing and activism is credited with helping to pass the Married Women's Property Act, which allowed married women to have their own property and wages, and the Matrimonial Causes Act, which allowed women to separate from abusive spouses. She founded the world's first anti-vivisection organization. If you've heard Martin say, was known as the Victoria Street Society, but is now the National Anti-Vivisection Society, was instrumental in the passage of the Cruelty to Animals Act, and founded the BUAV, the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, which is now Cruelty Free International. Now, how did she do this while being banned from attending or teaching university? Well, besides her unique talents, she was bolstered by having come from a prominent Anglo-Irish family. Her great-grandfather was Archbishop of Dublin, and her 370-acre family estate, Newbridge House, which you can see here, is now open to the public who make a day of visiting it. She also never married a man, though she was partnered. This is Mary Lloyd, and they were together for several decades. Our story begins in 1863. A series of reports circulated that year of French veterinary students performing vivisection as part of their routine studies. Derived from the words for alive and cutting, vivisection refers to invasive experimentation or demonstration on living animals. Instead of using cadavers, French students performed some 60 operations over multiple hours on live horses, leaving in their wake mangled creatures, hoofless, eyeless, burned, gashed, eviscerated, skinned, mutilated in every conceivable way. Cobbe set out to ascertain the limits of human rights over other animals and wrote The Rights of Man and the Claims of Brutes. As far as she knew, it was the first attempt to deal with the moral question of using non-human animals for scientific research. She wrote it before the invention of the term animal rights, which did not emerge until the 1870s. The same month her article was published, Cobbe learned of vivisection being conducted on dogs, pigeons, and other animals at a laboratory in Florence. Cobbe was also in Italy, working as a correspondent for the Daily News. She wrote a petition to shut down the laboratory, supported by 788 signatures by prominent figures. Her activism grew until she was the face of the anti-vivisection movement. In her work, she identified a new moral phenomenon, scientific cruelty. So I'm going to walk you through her animal ethics, and then I'm going to show you how she used an analysis of cruelty and torture to build up the concept of animal rights. All right, so any ethical theory has to address the question, whom do we consider when making moral decisions? For example, Kant extended moral standing only to those beings who possess a rational free will, which non-human animals did not appear to have to him. He thought the moral harm of the abuse of animals was reducible to the effects it has on humanity, such as encouraging callousness, not the effects on animals themselves. Descartes went so far as to describe non-human animals as soulless living machines, leading followers to defend animal abuse on the grounds that they are incapable of experiencing harm. An alternative view, often associated with utilitarianism, bases moral standing on sentience, or the capacity to feel pain and pleasure. In the 20th century, philosopher Peter Singer developed this understanding of moral standing into a robust animal ethics, arguing for the equal consideration of the interests of animals and calling for an end to most animal consumption and experimentation. But contrary to later developments in animal ethics, under Cobbe's influence, 19th century thought actually associated defenders of vivisection with utilitarianism. The history of this first wave of the animal advocacy movement has often been glossed over. The largely female leaders of the movement depicted as driven by sentiment rather than by ethical theory. Relatedly, the theism of the first wave has often been conflated with with religiosity when it is better understood as a continuation of the Enlightenment project. So Cobbe called her ethics intuitive moral philosophy. It was inspired by Immanuel Kant and the American transcendentalist preacher Theodore Parker. In her first book, Cobbe explained intuitive morality as the grasping of self-evident moral truths through the independent authority of the conscience. As a theist, she took God to be absolute goodness and the personification of the moral law, which informs the conscience in which we innately sense a duty to follow. Though self-evident truths are eternal and universal, she believed in progressive intuitionism, in which moral understanding evolves as indistinct concepts and principles become increasingly clear and distinct. She rejected what she took to be the contingency of utilitarian claims. Another main concern was that utilitarianism, under which she included the new Darwinian thought of the day, could not account for the duty to care for the vulnerable. In The Rights of Man and the Claims of Brutes, Cobbe did not refer to animal rights, vocabulary which did not yet exist. Instead, she framed ethical consideration as dictated by claims, that is, our duties to other animals. Her earlier work had identified central moral principles, including thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, and be perfect as thy Father who is in heaven is perfect. By love, Cobbe meant a disinterested and impartial benevolence to all sentient beings. She assumed all beings are created by God for a purpose or an end, which is God is absolutely good, must be a good end. She took the end of merely sentient beings to be happiness, so that we have an obligation to disinterestedly support the happiness of all fellow creatures or neighbors, including non-human animals. Humans, however, have virtue as our end, which is what she meant by the obligation to be perfect. When we love our human neighbors, we aim to support their virtue, as their happiness is a merely secondary aim. Now, Cobbe's notion that sentience confers moral standing differed from that of the utilitarians with which it became later associated. She employed a notion of universal moral law, writing the duty if the creature could feel pain to avoid inflicting it, if it could feel pleasure to bestow it, is a necessary moral law, since we cannot even conceive the contrary, nor figure to our imaginations a world or condition of things where the obligation could be suspended or reversed. She also used a Kantian idea to argue against Kant's position that we have only an indirect duty to non-humans. A defining feature of duty is that it is not prudential. So each duty must be done for its own sake. The attempt to produce our own moral culture out of our beneficence is by the hypothesis absurd. We're bound to consider the welfare of the brutes for their sakes, not ours, and because they are so constituted as to suffer and enjoy. Now, in her early work, Cobbe thought vivisection might be acceptable if anesthesia was used. However, though she helped to develop and pass it, she ultimately viewed the Cruelty to Animals Act as a mistake, insofar as it legitimized vivisection. She came to see that even so-called painless experimentation entailed the disregard of animals as creatures created for their own ends. This was erroneously justified through a misguided interpretation of the Kantian hierarchy, in which the sentient nature of humanity was placed above the moral nature of humanity in order to allow the misuse of other sentient beings. Now, Cobbe's abolitionism became more strident as her theory developed. She resigned her writing posts when publishers refused to condemn vivisection. She fell out with Darwin and others who refused to publicly denounce it. And she ultimately broke away from the Victoria Street Society to found the BUAV. Choosing the pursuit of scientific truth above our duty to other animals violates rational morality. She wrote, "As life is more than meat, so are there better things to live for than knowledge or escape from pain. Nor is any fact which science can reveal worth acquiring at the price of selfishness and cruelty. The brutes are not mere toys and puzzles put here by their creator and ours, that we may freely divert ourselves by breaking them to pieces to see how his wisdom has made them." Vivisection entails a practical contradiction. As a moral rule, it defeats its own end. She wrote, "Physical science, the knowledge of God's material creation, is in its highest sense a holy thing. The revelation of God's power, wisdom, love through the universe of inorganic matter and organic life. But the revelation of God in creation cannot be reached through the abuse and destruction of that creation." As to the claim of benefiting humankind, this argument has a false premise, she said, that a practice which, in the opinion of experts, conduces to the bodily health of one or more persons becomes ipso facto morally lawful and right. Vivisection conduces to the bodily health of one or more persons, therefore it must be lawful and right. She countered, bodily health, relief from pain, prolongation of life are not the only or the greatest good to be sought for man. Arguments defending it all rest on the crude, stupid, heathenish assumption that the moral interests of mankind are not worth considering and the physical interests are all in all. In 1895, she wrote The Divine Law of Love in response to Jesuit priest Joseph Rickaby, who defended vivisection on the grounds that we have only indirect duties to other animals. First, she took issue with the stance that rights and duties assume reciprocity. This critique was already implicit in her earlier essay with the title The Rights of Man and the Claims of Brutes, suggesting that non-human animals may have claims, that is, be moral patients, even though they may not be moral agents with duties. Cobbe distilled Rickaby's argument down to the following: only beings possessed of understanding are persons, and only persons have rights. Beasts do not possess understanding, therefore beasts are not persons, consequently beasts have no rights. She countered by stating that regardless of the truth of the first premise, the second was false. Darwinian thought showed a continuum in creatures, such that at least some non-humans possess understanding, and so should be considered persons with rights. But she made a more general critique of Rickaby's way of framing moral response. Rickaby used the language of personhood and rights to draw artificial barriers to see how much harm may be done to another and how little need be done to help. He focused on negative duties or prohibitions on actions and ignored positive duties or obligations to perform actions. An orientation toward positive duties would instead consider how much can I do to serve and bless a fellow creature. Positive duties combine action with sentiment. They are virtues, our highest end. And not just refraining from harm, but actively supporting the ends of others. An orientation toward positive duties uses cultivated sympathy to discern appropriate action. For virtue has an epistemological component as well as a practical component. As Cobbe put it, love is not only the fulfilling of the law, but the light in which the law becomes plain. This was in keeping with her belief in progressive intuitionism, the ability for cultivation to render necessary truths increasingly clear. She argued, the principle of the Christian law of love is one of unlimited extension, and it is to misconceive its essential characteristics to imagine that it can be properly stopped at a certain line, either of neighborhood, tribe, creed, nation, sex, or species. So here she's anticipating critiques of speciesism. She acknowledged she was asking us to transcend instinct, writing, we may naturally feel a little more spontaneous sympathy with the suffering man than with the suffering horse, but what is the ethical reason why we should prefer the pain of 1,000 horses to that of a single man? To the question of how far to extend moral standing, she explained as far as sentience extends. So congratulations, you now have a theory of animal moral standing. But how do you convince others, especially if there is not yet a concept of animal rights? Cobbe found that logic rarely worked alone, and that she had to tailor her rhetoric to specific audiences. If an opinion is based on arguments, then arguments can be used to change it. But if it is based on feeling, the insertion of reason into a discussion can cause the holder of the stance to become even more entrenched. As she put it, they take it that their feelings have some deeper ground which the arguments do not reach. The problem was not that women's rights and animal protection activists were too sentimental. It was that they were too rational. If critiquing arguments doesn't work, what is a philosopher to do? Well, Cobbe applied her theory of progressive intuitionism and found existing affect Latin concepts she could clarify and expand: cruelty and torture. Now, cruelty was a concept linked to the women's movement, for one of the only ways women could obtain separation from a spouse was to prove cruelty. Meanwhile, the world's first animal welfare society was the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. When legislation was passed ostensibly protecting animals, this was called the Cruelty to Animals Act. Cruelty against women and animals was also linked in the cultural imagination because approximately 70% of anti-vivisectionists were women, and because Cobbe was their leader. So around the time that she was expanding the concept of torture to include vivisection, Cobbe also expanded it to include domestic violence. She wrote Wife Torture in England to promote the passage of the Matrimonial Causes Act. As mentioned, this supported women leaving abusive spouses. She linked the treatment of women and non-human animals in her explanation of the title. She writes, "I have called this paper English Wife Torture because I wish to impress my readers with the fact that the familiar term wife beating conveys about as remote a notion of the extremity of the cruelty indicated as when, using euphemisms, vivisectors talk of scratching a newt's tail when they refer to burning alive or dissecting out the nerves of living dogs or torturing 90 cats in one series of experiments. Language that concealed and normalized moral harm instead of conveying experience indicated hermeneutical injustice, by which I mean an absence of adequate concepts as a result of prejudice or a deficient sympathy with victims and an excess sympathy with perpetrators. To explain this phenomenon, Cobbe developed a theory of what she called heteropathy, a disidentification with others that manifests as cruelty, disgust, contempt, and delight in their suffering. The term heteropathy was Cobbe's own invention. She explained it as the converse of sympathy. So while sympathy denotes feeling with another, the etymology of heteropathy suggests feeling opposed to or different from one another. So 70 years before Simone de Beauvoir, Cobbe argued that at the origin of every society is an opposition to groups marked as other, such as women and non-human animals. She theorized that our earliest encounters with others are not characterized by altruistic identification that prompts care, but by a self-interested repulsion that prompts malice. Writing, "The emotion felt at such stages at the sight of the pain of another is more nearly allied to anger and irritation than to tenderness and pity. The emotion felt at the sight of pleasure of another more akin to displeasure than to reflected enjoyment." To explain heteropathy, Cobbe used an account of domestic violence. She writes, "The group of his shivering and starving children and weeping wife is the sad sight which, greeting the eyes of the husband and father reeling home from the gin shop, somehow kindles his fury. If the baby cry in the cradle, he taps on it. If his wife wring her hands in despair, he fells her to the ground." Expressions soliciting care often trigger an impulse to destroy the vulnerable. The more the wife and baby cry, the more the abusive husband wants to beat them. The more feeble and miserable a bullied child becomes, the more his tormentors justify their actions. Meanwhile, onlookers take pleasure in identification with power. Pity is withheld from the victim and misapplied to the perpetrator, such that an abnormal attention is paid to the perpetrator's life, including their inner life, while the victim is silenced. She relayed that the most tender-hearted of fox hunters and fowlers tell us that they sympathize so much with the hounds that they have no time to feel for the fox. To correct this, Cobbe made the moral criterion the experience of victims, not the intentions of perpetrators. She explained, by this word cruelty, I mean the infliction on any innocent and sentient creature of intense suffering for some end other than the benefit of that creature. Suffering of which it may be said that it converted its existence from a blessing to a curse. Her definition of cruelty overlapped with definitions used in cases in which women sought the ability to leave their husbands. Though physical violence was initially thought to be essential, after numerous legal and social debates, the concept of cruelty was expanded to include mental and emotional cruelty. That cruelty converts life from being a blessing to a curse meant that even if anesthesia was used, the continual terror of vivisection experienced by an animal with no possibility of escape and constant anticipation of harm, the depression and lack of vitality from lack of agency and loss of trust in the world, could count as cruelty. Turning to the motivations for cruelty, she identified 5 types. So we have ignorant, or being unaware of the pain caused, careless, or being indifferent to the pain caused, wanton, which is causing pain to experience emotional excitement at the spectacle, malignant, which is taking direct pleasure in the pain of a hated victim, and she thought most importantly, interested cruelty. This is cruelty for ulterior purposes or for the benefit of third parties. Her distinctions challenged existing notions, which tended to recognize only wanton and malignant cruelty. For example, under anti-cruelty laws, a conviction had to prove that cruelty was deliberate and unnecessary. But in her analysis, it was interested cruelty which was the most dangerous, for an elaborate apparatus had been built to support and conceal it. As she put it, ignorant cruelty can be instructed, careless cruelty can be admonished and corrected. Wanton and malignant cruelty are condemned alike by public opinion. But the interested cruelty, which justifies the torture it inflicts by pointing to profits to be obtained thereby, cannot be instructed or admonished, nor in the present state of law and public opinion can it always be punished or reprehended. Yet this is the precise kind of cruelty from which all the worst crimes in history have sprung. For many, the new evil of vivisection, interested scientific cruelty, was inconceivable. Cruelty seemed to be inherently unnecessary, while scientific cruelty was ostensibly justified on utilitarian grounds. But this justification was based on the apparently noble intentions of perpetrators and not on a disinterested consideration of the experience of victims. So Cobbe identified the most dreadful form of cruelty as the torture, the burnings, impalings, flayings, boiling in oil, breaking on the wheel of captives, criminals, heretics, and revolted slaves. The Victorians and we assume society has advanced beyond such cruelty. But as she pointed out, beyond these barbarities to men and surviving still, when the torture of the most heinous murderer would no longer be permitted in Europe, the harmless brutes are now subjected to the most prolonged and acute agonies in hundreds of laboratories. This anomaly is permitted in the interest of human bodies for the diseases of which it is supposed to seek remedies, just as burnings to the death by the Inquisition were sanctioned in the interest of human souls to prevent the spreading of perilous heresy. Torture was one of the most salient concepts Cobbe could have used when addressing her 19th century audience. It tapped into the ways Victorian Britain positioned itself against prior centuries and against other cultures they viewed as being ruled by unchecked sovereigns and priests. Though Cobbe continued to emphasize positive duties, she shifted from discussing the claims of animals to the rights of animals. This was a radical new development in moral philosophy. Though both terms elicit corresponding duties, the latter also denotes clear prohibitions, negative duties that must never be violated, and accompanied her shift toward rejecting any form of vivisection. Her use of this new term was careful and qualified as she introduced it. She writes, "I do not plead. None of us friends of animals have ever pleaded for equal rights for animals with men, only for the recognition of some rights on their side. One thing only I have distinctly insisted on, their right to be exempted from the very worst evil which can be inflicted upon them, namely torture." One of her lines about vivisection as torture, "The least of all rights is to be spared the worst of all wrongs," became a slogan incorporated into talking point guides. So here you have a 1925 BOAV manual, which is advising activists on how to nudge others towards conceding at least some rights. So has an animal the same rights as a man? No, but the least of all rights is to be spared the worst of all wrongs. That vivisection is the worst of all wrongs is proved by the reception of the idea always given to the idea of using human subjects. The extension of the concept of torture to include vivisection went hand in hand with a useful analogy. Scientists were to vivisection as sovereigns and inquisitors were to torture. Here is the manual again. If you have the right to kill an animal, how can you say that you have not the right to put it to pain and suffering, which is a lesser thing? Answer, where is the alternative? Vivisectors do both. The real question should be, if I have the right to kill an animal, may I torture it as well? The answer is no. We have given that answer in the case of man by allowing killing in war and in punishment for murder, but stopping the practice of torturing prisoners of war and criminals. Are not vivisectors often good men? Yes, so were the inquisitors. Concept expansion and use of analogy rendered a radical new idea familiar without needing to assert equality between human and non-human animals and without needing to take a stance on other uses of animals. It was a sophisticated gateway concept. A prohibition on torture accompanies the idea of bodily integrity of a body that has boundaries. Prior to modernity, pain and suffering did not belong to victims, but had a higher religious and political purpose, with communal significance as signs of punishment, pollution, or sacrifice. With modernity came an increasing sense of the separateness and the sacredness of human bodies. Pain and suffering now belong to the individual, with significance as harms to that specific embodied being. This was the utter secularization of the moral, where pain was disenchanted. So that instead of a theoretical rights framework coming before the prohibition on torture, a newly self-evident prohibition on torture comes prior to the establishment of other rights. Now, animal bodies have often been seen as lacking in integrity, as essentially violable and dismemberable, as mere meat and resource. They are taken to be not the kind of thing that can be tortured, except in the pre-modern sense of serving as a communal sacrifice, because they have no boundaries to be violated. Cobbe's insight was to see that if they could draw on existing critiques of cruelty to prohibit the torture of non-human animals, then they could establish the understanding that their bodies are their own, that their pain and suffering has significance insofar as it matters to them, and not mere communal significance. It was the minimum right, but it could establish other rights. Insofar as women were subject to similar cruelties and conceptual frameworks, allowing for separation as a remedy to domestic torture, recognizing women's bodily integrity and autonomy, could likewise pave the way for women to have other rights, such as the right to vote. Cobbe pointed out that treatment of animals retains a pre-Enlightenment religious form of the moral. Following the inquisitor analogy, torture used to be done in the name of politics and religion to extract secrets. Now it is done in the name of science and medicine to extract nature's secrets. Like abusive lords of old, humans seeking to avoid pain and suffering nominate the weak to be their surrogates. But when vivisectors speak of sacrificing non-human animals, she wrote, the voluntary and conscious self-sacrifice of A for the welfare of B, C, and D is made out as if it is the same thing as the enforced and unintelligent sacrifice of A by B for C's sake. But animals neither volunteer themselves for sacrifice nor have ever sinned, and according to common belief, will not be compensated for injustice in a future life. So Cobbe declared the method of extracting nature's secrets and alleviating human suffering through the torture and sacrifice of non-human animals sheer unmitigated evil. As she explained, medical treatment has historically been valued in proportion to the price to be paid, whether through money or suffering. This belief in the enchantment of pain maintains a doctrine of sacrifice, such that if patients could only pay enough or suffer enough, they must be cured. Through the idea of vicarious sacrifice, this suffering is transferred to non-human animals, their lives the price to be paid, as if the more animals are tortured and killed, the more a human cure is seemingly assured. Foreshadowing Regan, Cobbe maintained it is not morally acceptable to transfer risks and harms to those who do not voluntarily adopt them. As she put it, few would purchase immunity from disease with the torture of 100 dogs, and it is hard to believe that the vivisector is really more interested on our behalf than we are for ourselves. Yet vivisectors go against the wishes of existing people from whom they know they must hide what they are doing. It is a peculiar morality that withholds information from and violates the wishes of existing equals by abusing the vulnerable near in order to benefit the unseen and not yet existing. But under the influence of heteropathy, it is not just animals who are turned into sacrifices. Scientists themselves also depict themselves as noble sacrifices. She wrote, "Our opponents, who are almost to a man utilitarians, talk grandiloquently of their duty to vivisect in the sacred cause of humanity, and bid us stand by and admire their deep sympathy with human suffering, which makes them sacrifice all their own tender sentiments of compassion to animals in the hope of bringing some relief." So see how heteropathy is directing pity inward by and to the vulnerable, right, who lament that they are forced to sacrifice their humanity, while no attention is given to the silenced victims. Now, later philosophers such as Regan critiqued the use of cruelty and kindness as moral criteria. Kindness, Regan argued, is not owed to anyone. He instead proposed a theory of animal rights based on recognizing animals as subjects of a life that have values to be respected and supported. He was concerned that cruelty and kindness focused too much on the intention and mental states of perpetrators, writing, "The charge of cruelty will be taken as a denunciation of what they are, evil people, rather than of what they do." He cautioned this would give perpetrators an easy way out, since they could argue that only they know their mental state and that they derive no enjoyment from the act. But at the time of his critique, Cobbe's work was largely erased from history, which may have limited his analysis. Contrary to his anemic account of kindness, she took the positive obligation of disinterested benevolence to actually have the force of universal moral law and to be owed to all. Like Regan, she emphasized supporting the ends of each creature, though she rooted this in theism, not an account of subjectivity. Most importantly, in expanding the concept of torture, she gave a foundation for animal rights analogous to that which had been given a century prior for human rights. And it was this move that later ethicists such as Regan glossed over in their dismissal of the significance of cruelty and with it torture as moral concepts. So this leaves his concern that the framework of cruelty focuses too much on intentions. Cobbe's centering of the experience of victims, analysis of types of cruelty, and account of heteropathy anticipated these objections, however. So I'm going to wrap up with the debate over strategy that speaks both to Cobbe's contributions and to her erasure from history. Cobbe was faced with the problem: how do you get those with privilege to recognize moral harm and act to stop it despite their absence of sympathy? Indeed, while they are incapable of identifying with others. she used intuitive induction. By this, I mean the selection and enumeration of particulars in such a way that a concept is clarified so that facts are transformed in light of a binding concept. That sounds a bit complex, but I'll show you 3 examples which will make it clear. As I go through them, notice how Cobbe generated cognitive estrangement. So this is isolating a fact from a familiar narrative or context in order to transform its meaning. Notice also how in the face of heteropathy, turning suffering into numbers and terse third-person reports makes it more real than first-person narration or sentimental fiction. So first we have an anti-vivisection pamphlet, Light and Dark Places. So argumentation takes the form of a collection of reports and illustrations. Since animals cannot testify, the material came from scientists themselves. She called attention to her own process, performing objectivity, writing, "Every illustration in this pamphlet may be taken with certainty to be a vivisector's own picture of his own work, such as himself has chosen to publish it." So I'm going to show you a set. The material is disturbing, although I've shown one of the least graphic images. So I'm not going to read the excerpt aloud. You can decide for yourself if you would like to view it. And I will, in a second, move to the accompanying diagram. All right, next we have a book called The 9 Circles of Hell in reference to Dante's Inferno. Now, animals don't care about the purpose of an experiment or its findings. They care about their experience. So to bring us into that mindset, this book organized experiments according to type of torture, the 9 circles of hell. Again, the victims cannot speak, so testimony comes from perpetrators, the reports of the presiding spirits, the scientists. The only commentary, so just notice this as an interesting use of rhetoric for philosophic argumentation. The only commentary is in the preface, where Cobbe assured nothing in the text has been added save verbatim extracts with references. So I'm going to show you an example. Once again, I'm not going to read it out loud, and you can decide if you would like to do so yourself. Cobbe also wrote the preface to the British Vivisectors Directory, a black book for the United Kingdom, which listed the names, affiliations, and evidence of the torture conducted by some of the most prominent members of society. Again, the testimony came from the perpetrators themselves, but now it was organized under their names. So you can see it's a compendium of different perpetrators. For example, you see David Ferrier. This was the first person to be tried under the Cruelty to Animals Act. And you see Thomas Huxley. So in the absence of legal remedies, the public had the possibility to shun them and take their business elsewhere. A letter by Eleanor Vere Boyle is indicative of reactions to Cobbe's efforts. She wrote to Cobbe that she cannot read the material as it is too upsetting. She is downtrodden at the list of perpetrators and warns that each physician listed has their own kingdom of hundreds of patients that will not go against them. Similarly, Wilkie Collins, who used Cobbe's research to write his novel Hard and Science, explained in letters to her that he intended to write without terrifying and revolting the reader, saying, "If I told the audience 1/10 of what you know, they would close the book." He instead made the vivisector the object of compassion and hid the true horrors of their abuse in order to not turn off readers and get them to stay with the moral argument. Generations later, activists are still debating rhetorical strategy and ultimately moral epistemology. Now, unfortunately, Cobbe's own theory of heteropathy predicted her fate in history. The result of works such as the Black Book where sympathy was extended to perpetrators and Cobbe was the one shunned. Women anti-vivisectionists extending Enlightenment concepts and employing philosophic arguments were branded sentimental and irrational. And so Cobbe was erased from the history of philosophy. But even though she was forgotten, the revolution in moral understanding could not be stopped. Thank you. And so it's my pleasure to now welcome Sue Leary to come up, who will give us a response.
Place the water bottle. So I should hit stop share?
If you hit stop share, we'll see just you.
Lucky you all.
Okay.
I see Mark.
And hit the image there.
My Sarah Scott.
Yeah, that one, so we can see you full screen.
I'm trying.
It's all set now. I fixed it.
Set, you're going to set it, Carol?
It's all set. Yep.
Okay. Online, they can see.
Sorry, technical arrangements. Well, you can see me.
Yes.
Yeah,
They can see you.
Don't look there. Look over here. I don't have slides. Yay or not? Not sure how you feel about that. Well, anyway, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here. I thank the Culture and Animals Foundation for inviting me here today. And thanks to Manhattan College for hosting this event. I met Tom Regan in the early days of my animal advocacy and got to know him a little better over the years, attending the conferences that he organized in North Carolina. And I invited him to give the keynote at American Anti-Vivisection Society's 125th anniversary, which was in 2008. He was a brilliant speaker and a brilliant thinker, and I remember him with great appreciation. Thank you, Dr. Scott, for your research and your presentation. Of course, I've been around for a while, but I didn't know Frances Power Cobbe. We didn't overlap. But the founder of American Anti-Vivisection Society certainly did know her. American AV was founded by Carolyn Earl White, who sailed to England in the 1800s on a number of occasions to meet Frances Power Cobbe and other colleagues who were working in the early days of animal protection. In her address to the International Anti-Vivisection and Animal Protection Congress in Washington, D.C. in 2013, Carolyn Earl White started her presentation by saying, Miss Frances Power Cobbe was the apostle of anti-vivisection. She later credits Miss Cobbe with inspiring the establishment of the American Anti-Vivisection Society, AAVS, as we call it, again founded in 1883 in Philadelphia, which was Mrs. White's hometown and mine too. So I welcome you to learn more about AAVS's past, present, and future on the website, which is aavs.org. So when I mentioned to Martin Rowe that I wasn't sure if I was qualified to be a respondent, since I don't really have academic credentials, he said that Culture and Animals Foundation was most interested to hear my perspective as a practitioner of advocacy against vivisection over the decades. So I'm really here primarily as someone who can provide a report from the front lines. And indeed, it is a very interesting time for our issue, both politically and scientifically. Both of those are drivers, big drivers in the progress or lack thereof for animals used in science. But before I share some thoughts about that, I do want to respond to one aspect of Dr. Scott's presentation, the use of the word torture in relation to animal experiments. And I'm going to do that with a true story about Jane Goodall. who, since her recent death, which you probably know about, I believe has demonstrated the effectiveness of her style of advocacy. It was August 11th, 2011, at the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C. It was an information gathering session of the committee that had been formed to produce a report, which finally produced a report, Chimpanzees in Biomedical and Behavioral Research, Assessing the Necessity. It was chaired by bioethicist Jeffrey Kahn. The three objectives of the meeting were to obtain background data on current use of chimpanzees in biomedical and behavioral research. Second, to explore potential alternative models to chimpanzees. And third, to seek public comment about the scientific need for chimpanzees in biomedical behavioral research. So along with many colleagues from national animal protection organizations that had been urgently working to get chimpanzees out of labs, I was there to provide one of those public comments. Being the National Academy of Sciences, the presentations were pretty dry, very scientific, all very respectful atmosphere. There certainly were many widely varying different points of view in the room, but morning sessions were explaining what kinds of research were done on chimpanzees. We broke for lunch, and the agenda said that after lunch, there was going to be a special lecture by Jane Goodall via video conference, which was a pretty fancy thing at the time. This is before Zoom. Everybody was doing Zoom calls. I came back to the room after lunch and it was packed. People who worked at the National Academy of Sciences had poured out of their offices, apparently, that were upstairs and filled all the seats. The lecture room, bigger than this, was overflowing. People standing in the aisles and in the back, the doors all open. Everybody wanted to hear Jane Goodall. Leading the discussion after her presentation, Jeffrey Kahn asked Jane Goodall, "Is it torture?" And she paused and then said, "To them it is." So, to them it is. Now, I don't recall any elaboration on that, but simple truth and a powerful message. And it was delivered in her very special way. She was always very low key. And that was pretty effective. I've seen lots of folks work against type in that way. It can be very effective. But let me move on to share with you some of the changes I've seen over the years regarding this issue, vivisection, where we are now and how the future looks for animal use in science. I don't have a lot of time, so we're talking about an overview, but I'm certainly happy to take questions and point anyone to resources and references if you want to follow up with me. So how did I do this? I was a little science girl. I had a chemistry set and a microscope on my kitchen table. I loved animals, and so everybody figured that goes together. You'll become a veterinarian. That was my plan. I took a slightly different path. I did major in biology, got my degree in that, but focusing on the emerging field of ethology. So in other words, studies of animal behavior. I wanted to be Jane Goodall. I graduated in 1976, and I was fortunate in that time to be a young person in college when there was a lot of openness to nonconformist views, certainly more than previous decades. The civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and the women's movement were all still very fresh and ongoing. I also discovered my inclination for organizing people and projects. I organized the committee that established a women's center, which evolved into a domestic violence shelter and just celebrated its 50th year. But animal rights hadn't made it to my campus. I watched Harry Harlow films. Some of you may know that he did maternal deprivation experiments, and there were a lot of films of those with a lot of suffering of baby monkeys, infant monkeys. And I thought, that's sad. So first it was a feeling. But then I remembered from the women's movement, the personal is political. And so I thought maybe standing up for animals could be a political issue, could be a political activity. Then I went to an animal rights conference in 1977, and my determination to work for change for animals was awakened. I soon became the coordinator of a group that had been growing in Philadelphia called Philadelphia Vegetarians, and then the coordinator of the Pennsylvania Animal Rights Coalition, where I had the opportunity to work with and meet some wonderful people like Henry Spira and Tom Regan. So there was a lot. There was a lot happening in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, stimulated in large part by Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, and a whole generation of people like me who had witnessed other social movements and saw ways to apply it. Much as I believe Carolyn Earl White was able to do. She came out of the anti-slavery movement. So Henry Spira, who I mentioned, a New Yorker, was a groundbreaking campaigner in our space, uniting many organizations like the American Anti-Vivisection Society to oppose the Drey's rabbit eye test, and mobilized consumers against companies that were targeted for cosmetic testing. He wrestled agreement out of those companies to fund development of alternative methods. PETA, or People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, emerged at that time, in that era. They embraced the sort of expose approach and were successful in breaking through a lot of media complacency and skepticism. Large demonstrations were arranged. 1983, Mobilization for Animals had demonstrations at the 4 regional primate centers. So that's just a snapshot, but just suffice to say it was a time of real growth. Animal groups were funding alternatives research. There were amendments to the Animal Welfare Act. Bioengineering was changing science. Numbers of animals went down and then went up again because of the genetic engineering of mice. But in the 1990s, the chimpanzee issue emerged because the intense breeding of chimpanzees in labs for AIDS and HIV research resulted in a real problem, as they discovered that chimpanzees were not found to be a good model for the disease. So we had captive bred chimpanzees, and what happens to them? A series of policy matters around the chimpanzees resulted in the Chimp Act, which mandated retirement of chimpanzees, federally owned and supported chimpanzees who were no longer used in research, and further that their retirement would be funded by NIH. It was championed by a member of Congress who was definitely not an anti-vivisectionist, but he was the chair of the science subcommittee, so he was very influential because that subcommittee provided oversight of NIH, including funding. And he happened to be the representative for the then executive director of American Anti-Vivisection Society, Tina Nelson. And I think she had a lot to do with influencing him. And I'd say that the next big moment came when the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, asked the National Academy of Sciences to form an expert committee, which resulted in a publication called Toxicity Testing in the 21st Century, a Vision and a Strategy. It was a remarkable moment when leading toxicologists came together and were tasked to seriously assess if there was a better and more humane way to conduct safety assessments of chemicals regulated by the agency, in other words, the EPA. Dr. Martin Stevens, at the time Vice President of Animals and Research at the Humane Society of the United States, or HSUS, now Humane World for Animals, served on the committee as well. I attended the meetings that were public, although it started its work quietly under the radar for most of the animal protection organizations. You can look up the report. I encourage you to. But I can tell you that the most remarkable thing was the determination of the committee leadership after the report was published not to have it sit on the shelf. These scientists spent 2 years and more after publication in 2007, taking on all challenges and questions and what ifs from their peers. I credit the committee with doing the hardest work that can really only be done by a peer group, persuading the regulatory tox community, including some extremely big players, big multinational chemical companies, that animals don't have to figure into public safety analysis and don't have to be mandated. Much more was done to realize the vision. Tremendous work on federal legislation to reform chemical oversight by the EPA. There were excellent sections championed by Senator Cory Booker to set a bar for acceptance of NAMs if, this was the language in the bill, if as good or better than the animal tests. That bill passed in 2016. Animal protection groups that deserve a shout out for that are HSUS again, Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine did a lot of work on that, and Humane Society Legislative Fund. They all deserve credit for hashing out the details of legislation, which is its own form of torture. And again, fits and starts. You know, legislation is not the end. Writing and implementing the regulations is where a lot of the battles go. But the statutory language is there, and it's been very effective. So those are just a couple of examples about how very meaningful change can happen. Many factors have to sort of converge. It's somewhat unpredictable, but change is going to happen. So in my view, you might as well jump in and try to press it to go in the right direction. So what about today and what about the future? We are in a unique moment right now. We have a federal administration that is skeptical of and even hostile to traditional science. Presumably, this is part of a larger picture that folks who help animals may or may not agree with. But it happens to coincide with a moment in which alternatives, which have been prepped for decades for launch, are being given the green light. And you can see for yourselves, there's things you can look up. The new standardized organoid modeling center has been launched by NIH. It's going to be amazing. Food and Drug Administration has a new policy statement that for certain drugs, they are instructing companies to submit safety data from non-animal methods. It's a genuine moment of opportunity, and animal advocates should be proud of the role we've played in ensuring that the science is able to address these regulatory needs without animal testing. But speaking of needs, I want to wrap it up with this, circling back to that chimpanzees in biomedical and behavioral research assessing the necessity, the word necessity being very important there, key. Before the meeting I mentioned earlier that had Jeff Kahn and Jane Goodall, the first meeting of the committee was actually in May 2011. There was a different committee chair. He had to resign after some due diligence by animal advocates pointed out his conflict of interest. And representatives from NIH were at that meeting. NIH had been asked by Congress to sponsor the study. They helped open it. An NIH representative was tasked to charge the committee, expressing their task. And she said that they should look only at the science and that ethics was outside the scope of NIH's interest. Members of the committee, some of them, questioned how they could possibly consider necessity without considering ethics. It seemed to me that the NIH representative started to get quite frustrated, finally admitted that NIH was only doing this because Congress insisted, and that they don't feel that there is any unnecessary use of chimpanzees because their system is good and it is set up to ensure that does not happen for chimpanzees or any animal. If animals are being experimented on, it must be necessary because they've approved it. And yet, after a very thoughtful and admittedly resource-intensive examination, the committee concluded exactly that chimpanzees were not necessary for the uses in NIH-funded research that they had looked at. I was struck by how very sure the NIH scientists were, very firm in their position, but they were mistaken. And I think we were all shocked when, within a half hour of the committee's release of their report, NIH Director Frances Collins issued a statement that NIH intended to comply with all of the committee's recommendations. They would appoint a special committee of their Council of Councils to determine how to implement their recommendations, which they did. And then ultimately in 2015, NIH decided to stop funding all invasive research on chimpanzees. Again, many factors contributed. There were other issues about retirement that got sticky, but I have visited personally many sanctuaries that now have chimpanzees retired from research. And it is most certainly a happy ending with them living their best lives. I believe that the advancement of alternative methods will keep moving very rapidly. The science is moving fast. That is essential to ending animal suffering in labs. But we need to be prepared for setbacks. Science moves very quickly, and it is highly complex. Interests diverge, which of course creates friction and tension. We need to be fully engaged to ensure progress for animals. That can only happen with informed and dedicated and principled advocacy. So meaningful, lasting change is the goal I articulated for our organizations in 1995, and a goal that we share with other colleagues and allies, and we've made a lot of progress. But what can we do as individuals to end? Keep learning, share our beliefs, build understanding, and act on our convictions to bring more kindness into the world in general and help animals in the ways that we can, or at least try. So good luck to each of you, and thank you for your interest.
Is there another seat?
Yeah, there is. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So we'll have a 10-minute Q&A. I know some of you have to go. We'll ask some questions.
Go on.
We have a question in the hall. We go straight to online questions.
Let's let the students that are leading the class step out.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, Maddie?
You mentioned earlier the partners. I was wondering if he did any kind of activism or writing
Right. So the question was asked about Mary Lloyd. This was Frances Power Cobbe's partner, if she was also involved in animal advocacy. She was involved insofar as she was members of organization and on leadership committees and things like that, but she herself was a much more private person. Cobbe was, I think she only survived doing the work that she did because she was extremely optimistic. Mary Lloyd was a bit misanthropic because of like the other side, that where the advocacy movement can take you. And so she preferred to be behind the scenes here, while Cobbe was the more optimistic advocate.
Yeah, this is just like follow-up question, I guess. But after Cobb's published the Black Book, was it more of like a concerted effort to sort of like forget her or like erase her work, or was it sort of just like kind of just like happened that people slowly forgot about her?
So the question was asked about the response to the Black Book, and was it a concerted effort to erase her or whatnot? It was both. So the Huntington Library has a collection of 900 letters that were sent to her, and I went through the 900 letters, and it was this emotional roller coaster as I could see the advocacy starting to take shape, and she's making all of this progress. And then she starts to expose the most prominent figures in society, and they all start to turn against her, and all of her friends leave her. And it's letter after letter where now people saying, I'm sorry, I can't support you. I'm sorry, I'm not going to sign a petition. I'm sorry, I can't do this and that. And then, yeah, she went from being one of her books, The Duties of Women, was proposed to be the ethics textbook for women's colleges in the United States. Like, that was her stature. And then within a decade or so, she was just eliminated. And now you will not find her name mentioned in any contemporary ethics book. So, yeah.
Did any of her work go beyond like the experimentation of animals, like to vegetarianism and like kind of the ethical treatment of animals as like, you know, like a resource as opposed to like a scientific endeavor?
Yeah, the question is asked about her other use, her writing about other uses of animals. She was not a vegetarian, and so this caused, she was really at the avant-garde, right? So you had the next generation who was promoting vegetarianism and other parts of the animal rights movement. She was really at the beginning, right? And so she did get some backlash from later advocates while she was alive. She became increasingly more sensitized to things. So from her class background, she initially defended sport, right? Like she defended, you know, fox hunting and things like that, saying, well, it'd be preposterous to compare that to vivisection. As the decades went on, she became more and more strident against the use of, you know, sport, writing really striking passages about how sport is really just killing and, you know, things like that. She was also against the use of feathers. This was a big topic of the era, like women using bird feathers in their hats and things like that. So she worked against sport and use for clothing and things like that, but not diet. And part of that is because industrialist farming did not exist. So she just had a different understanding of it.
Maybe online. Carol, do you want to read the first one?
Yeah, we have a couple questions here. Mia wants to know if Frances Power Cobbe's example and work was or is useful in Sue's work and that of associated organizations working on vivisection.
Well, that's hard to say. I can't say we refer to it very often on a day-to-day basis, but I was certainly interested to hear more today, and I think we do look back to Carol Nora White's work quite a bit. That's been our 19th century point of reference, but now we have a new one.
I think one way in which she might be useful would be to look at all of the different rhetorical techniques. So again, are you organizing the material under like new concepts or analogies? Are you organizing it under perpetrator? Once you start to organize it under perpetrator, you get into interesting trains of thought. Like, is it a part of a patriarchal society or something like that? Like once you start to think about the perpetrators. Also, I think the Black Book of Vivisectors goes along with actually like some of the Leaping Bunny, like the idea that like the consumer has a choice, right? Like we publish the list of the physicians and scientists, and now you can decide if you want that to be your doctor or not. And now the consumer can go look at products and decide, like, is that the product that I want to use or not?
You have a question online?
Yeah, Kim has a question. Kim says, great presentations. Thank you. I'm fascinated by the contrast between Frances Power Cobbe and Anna Kingsford. Can you please say something about the differences and dynamics between them?
Right. So actually, Anna Kingsford was one of the figures that I had in mind when I said that Frances Power Cobbe was critiqued by a younger generation of animal advocates. And it was precisely over the eating issue. Yeah, and it's going back to the earlier question, like for what reason was she forgotten? There were ways in which she was really dead outside of her time. Like she was in a sense too early and too late, right? So she was like too early to be adopted, and then by the time there was actually like a movement in place, she now seemed a bit old-fashioned out of the time. She's still talking about God, and she's still eating meat and stuff like that. And so you have this newer generation which is going to react against that.
Sarah, just thinking about the difference between the sort of deontological and utilitarian approaches, we, as you pointed out, we tend to think of concern for animals being motivated by utilitarian intuitions about sentience, and but you're pushing this, or well, I mean, not you, but in terms of Frances Power Cobbe talking about this notion that animals have ends, and that we should, in some sense, understand their ends, and not only that, but promote them or respect them. There's some claim about we maybe have an intuition about that. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to what you think, is a more, from a philosophical perspective, a more powerful appeal. Like, what do you think is the more powerful argumentative basis for a claim that we should have moral concern for animals? Is it the sentience claim, or are the utilitarians on the right track? Or, does somebody like Frances Power Cobbe and the deontological approach, which I guess Tom Regan revived in some sense, do you think that has the more powerful, stands to be the more powerful philosophical basis for these claims?
Yeah, it's a good question. The question is about like which has the better foundation, a deontological approach or a utilitarian approach. Now, in practice, if we're thinking about like advocacy, they're going to overlap on like 90% of issues, right? So like Peter Singer and Tom Regan collaborated on a lot of stuff and really supported each other, right? But there was still fundamental theoretical differences, and then those fundamental theoretical differences end up making like a huge difference when we get to like 10% of the cases, right? So, I mean, Cobbe's concern was really epistemological, that there was just no foundation for utilitarianism. That it was interesting because she didn't disagree with utilitarian principles. She disagreed with their foundation and said, like, we need to have a Kantian foundation where it's coming from duty and intuitive moral law. And then the intuitive moral law is what might give us utilitarian principles, right? But I mean, one way in which, I mean, it would be lovely if Regan were here to share his insights, like how would he react to Cobbe? But one thing which is interesting about Cobbe, which is just from a purely rhetorical standpoint, she maintains human hierarchy over non-human animals. And many ethicists and advocates might take issue with that approach, right? But at least in her time, but I think maybe even our time, it's maybe a bit more persuasive because you're not establishing equality, which people can kind of bristle about. But also because in insisting there's a hierarchy, she's holding humans to a higher moral standing. And she's saying we have a duty to be virtuous, not to pursue happiness. And this idea of supporting bodily health and stuff like that, that's not our highest end. And so it's, in some ways, it's easier for her to completely rule out all vivisection, because in the end, bodily health is not the highest good for her.
So I'd like to thank Sarah Scott and Sue Leary for the presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you for everybody online. Are you about to applaud or ask another question? Okay.
So we